and welcome to GenFriends. I'm your host, Cheri Hudson Passey from Carolina Girl Genealogy, and I've got this fabulous panel and special guest tonight. We have got Shelley Murphy, the family tree girl, on the panel
you
tonight.
Got it! Yay!
I wanted to go with you first to make sure I got it right.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here tonight.
I'm glad you're back. I'm glad you didn't decide not to come back. My crazy whatever. I don't know what happens to my brain when I push record. We've got Mary Kircher Roddy from MKR Genealogy. Hi, Mary.
Hi there.
Good to have you here.
Good to be here.
And Laura Hedgecock from Treasure Chest of Memories. Hey, Laura.
Hi, nice to be here.
Nice to have you here. We've got Bernice Bennett from Genie Bee Roots. Hey, Bernice.
Hello, hello.
And last but certainly not least, we have got our archive lady. We've got Melissa Barker in her archives in the background.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here.
You've been in the archives the last couple of times we filmed. Are you home now? Are you?
I'm home.
Yeah.
I'm home. We'll see how it goes tonight.
See how her internet goes. So if she pops out, she'll come back in.
I'll be back.
All righty. With our panel introduced, I want to introduce you to our very, very special guest tonight. We are going to talk to Judy Muhn, and we're going to talk to her about Native American research. You are Native American, and we thought, who else best to come talk to us about this? You run lineage journeys, and you specialize in Native American plus a bunch of other stuff. She's a woman that knows a lot of things. So we wanted to have you come on. You blog, you write, you give presentations. And we've all just have known you forever, and we just thought, oh, perfect person to come on and talk to us. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, so I started genealogy stuff at the age of 12 on the level of the documentation, right? Mm-hmm. So I was raised in a family that has a very strong oral tradition. So I was hearing about my ancestors from a very young age. Especially on my mom's side, because it's her side of the family that my native ancestry is. So I'm very much white-facing. I get that. A lot of people don't recognize that I'm Native American. I look like my Scottish ancestors, but my mom's side of the family is French Canadian and Native. So we refer to them. So part of my ancestry is Métis from Canada. And then Lakota from South Dakota, Pine Ridge. So, anyway, from a young age, oral tradition obviously was dominant in my brain, as well as a couple of languages. And at the age of 12, my mother's oldest sister, my beloved Aunt Catherine, took me to a library for the first time and actually showed me paperwork about my ancestors. So I got hooked. It was actually part of a school project, like a 6th grade, here's a 4-generation chart, go home, because they were trying to teach us about immigration. And I'm like, my people have always been here, so, but we moved around. So, and then the Scottish part of the family and, whatever.
Yeah.
So, but that got me hooked. So I've been doing this stuff since I was 12. I had to take off a fair amount of time in the early 2000 timeframe because I had a pretty intense job and worked probably, 70 hours a week. So genealogy took a back seat for a short interval. And then, of course, hormones took a back, front seat in, college. But I kept doing stuff. So I started back in the dark ages when there weren't, the big companies and the internet and all of that. So I did all of the stamped address, self-addressed stamped envelopes.
Yes.
And then waited and prayed by the mailbox.
Right.
And, yeah. So
does anybody miss that? I kind of miss that.
Yeah. Things in the mail a little bit.
Yes.
I miss it. I miss
it. I do
one.
miss some of it. I do miss some of the anticipation, right? The energy that comes from that.
Yes.
But On the other hand, I quite like being able to document my ancestors far better without having to drive all over the place.
This is true.
Especially because it's between, the US and Canada. It's like way too
Mm-hmm.
much driving, way too much.
I miss driving though. I
Oh,
wish I
do
could.
ya?
I do. I wish I could just get in my car and go to South Carolina, go to
I wish you could too.
Yeah, the two of you would have to hook up, right?
Yeah, we would. We definitely
Yes.
would.
Right.
Definitely would. Now I know, when you research an ethnic group, you research basics or research basics. You've got the same, you're looking at the same records sometimes, but with Native American, I know a lot of people have that story that they're Native American, but some people know that they're Native American, like you. I mean, you've got that oral history, that documentation. If you say you've got the story, what's the best thing to start with? If I've got the story, but it's because I'm from South Carolina and everybody in South Carolina has the Cherokee story, right?
Right.
So where would you start if you had a story?
Well, like always, right? Start with yourself, move backward in time,
Mm-hmm.
document birth, marriage, death, census, wills, land records, all of that good stuff. When you start getting back, so the 1900 and the 1910 censuses have special parts of the census that are notations specifically for Indians.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be a really great resource if your ancestor is that recent. So, right,
Mm-hmm.
1900,
Mm-hmm.
1910, that's pretty recent. A lot of folks have stories that go back far beyond that.
Right.
So for a lot of tribal people, paper records, like I can go through my Native ancestry going back like 20 some generations, but there's not paper for that. So there's paper for elements of it, and
Mm-hmm.
notably in Native records, dominantly the men are noted. So, the women having all the babies aren't being noted, right? I'm trying to
Right.
fix some of that in some of the records I'm doing on my own family because, hello, she's the
Yeah.
one that bore this child for 9 months.
Exactly.
But anyway, so the classic going back in time from yourself and documenting
Mm-hmm.
everything with what paper you can find. But then notably, some of the paper sources that are available for Native peoples because of colonization. So let's be
Mm-hmm.
really frank, there's a lot of really nasty things that happen to our people. And the records that were created to maintain order. Let's just say it that way. So, it was categorizing us. It was who gets benefits and who doesn't, who gets food, who doesn't, that kind of thing. But that created records. So there are what are called annuity rolls, an annuity list. There's correspondence that goes with that. There's certainly the very awful history of the Indian boarding schools, but that is a record source that can help combine families because classically in our tribes, there isn't the classic surname where you can follow backwards in time because, like I've had 3 different names, over the course of my life in my native or ceremonial roles, I've had 3 different names. So, and it doesn't follow a surname pattern. So that's something that you have to learn about. And that's where oral histories come in. And thank you to all of the universities and the archival places and all of that do oral history projects. Because sometimes that's the only way you're going to get those names so that you can actually document, something. So you have to be really good with alternate spelling systems and how things sound. Like trying to speak it out loud, especially if you're near tribal people and you can find out how they pronounce certain words so that you can kind of hear, oh, how might a white person have written that, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So Melissa,
know
I think I
Melissa's-
saw you had a
Yeah,
question.
she's got a question. Yeah.
I didn't want to interrupt. What we do
No,
is
it's
we
cool.
put that in there. As an archivist, I'm constantly telling genealogists that there's only about 5% of genealogical records online, and the rest are in archives that have not been
Right.
microfilmed, digitized, So with your expertise, about what percentage would you say Native American records are online as opposed to still sitting in archives?
Oh, you're probably very right. I think it's probably maybe online 10, 15%, maybe.
Yeah.
So the National Archives has a whole bunch, clearly not digitized yet. A lot of state and university archives have records. Again, they don't have the time, money, staff, right?
Mhm.
So, they're there. So you have to know to look, but you have to look by territories as well, right? We don't recognize state lines, country lines, all of that. So if I'm researching my family who now is, allotted land living in a place in South Dakota, I have to also look in Nebraska and Wyoming and up into Canada and maybe Minnesota, because different records existed under Indian agents at different times, under other governmental systems. And so then they're picked up by archives in those states or universities. So it's really important to sort of broaden the geographic search. So certainly from the standpoint, a lot of people know about the 5 tribes that were force marched in the Trail of Tears. Well, every tribe had those forced marches. So most of us, our people originated, further east or further north or something like that. Like my Lakota people were once around here in the Great Lakes. My Métis people, so I descend from Micmac and Abenaki, and, they originally were further east than they are currently with their holdings. So you have to broaden the archival research, like look into any of the resources that the archives have on finding aids. And, I've been doing some research for a professor in Canada who's studying early historical, trapper-trader kinds of relationships here in the Metro Detroit area. And that's all, it's held by the Burton Library, which is a very wonderful archive or library that we have here, but it's a special collection. So I'm actually, and I know Melissa, the thrill of you have your hands on these actual documents that are from the early 1700s, and you're reading this. These are all in French, and luckily I read French and speak a bit. So reading all of that and then getting the context of, well, what was going on for the people at that time and what was happening with, the trapping trading environment and who was influential and who wrote things down. So I've been going through these daily diaries of this one particular trader. And, but yeah, you have to poke around and dig into citations in books, especially university publications, right? Because the professors, if they're PhD people, they have to write. It's write and publish, write and publish.
That's right.
And so their books are well cited.
Yeah.
So, digging into that and finding out the resources that they use. So I study a lot of, sort of Great Lakes tribal histories because my Lakota people were here, in the Great Lakes early. So
well, I don't know why I was surprised, but about 3 years ago, I was fortunate enough to get a tour of the U.S. National Archives in Fort Worth, Texas. My in-laws live in Fort Worth. We were going there for vacation. So I set up a tour because I'm always encouraging genealogists to take tours and to see. And they were explaining to me what a large collection of Native American records they have there. Now,
Yes.
I didn't ask, what tribes, because I don't have Native American in my family or in my husband's family. But, and so it was very interesting that in the middle of Texas, it was, it was neat that they had those records there. And it was something I made a mental note of.
They're literally everywhere in the US. And, some more so than others. And especially, like I even got a notation today that a local library that the University of Michigan has, an archive, just recently bought 1749, I want to say, map of the original Detroit area fort. And, so you kind of sign into, archive mailing lists so that you get these email updates. You find out when they're doing talks, things like that. So, archives are just immensely valuable, and every state has them. So when my husband was in the military, what a blessing. I got to check out like all these archives all over the place, right? I mean, God bless the United States Air Force,
Hey, I'm an Air Force brat. I get
Me
that.
too.
Oh, all right.
Me
Yay.
too.
All right. Yay.
Laura, you said you have a
A
question.
not brat spouse.
Yeah, it's a quite a different question. You were talking about how everyone has this native story that they're not sure of. I was just wondering if there's a new group of people coming via DNA when they get their ethnicity estimate, or when they can solidify a story, they find some evidence for a story. I was wondering, so what role is DNA playing in Native American research?
Well, certainly as people are doing that DNA and then like, oh, surprise, right? I mean, I don't know anybody that hasn't done DNA and been surprised, right? I mean, everybody's like, oh, really? I thought we were like German. Oh, really?
No, I was
Yours
looking. I
good?
was looking for it. Yeah, I was looking for it because of family story. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a grandfather surprise that I didn't anticipate.
Oh.
So yeah, but that's another story. But anyway, yes.
That's another show. Okay.
That's another show.
show.
Yeah, if you want to talk about Scottish research, let me know. And I can tie in archives to that too. So, but nonetheless, yes, people, so certainly in my lineage journeys work, people will, connect with me and say, hey, either I've got this oral story that I'm trying to track, and I'm wondering which kind of company should I order my DNA from, and which one's best for Native ancestry. Well, then a really key element that, so certainly to Laura's point, some people are getting these tests, for a holiday gift or a birthday or whatever, but then they find, 2.5%, 5%, whatever, and they didn't know. So that could be helpful. The challenge being, of course, that number one, those of us that are Native. So I've tested, but thankfully I am truly blessed by having, the income to do it. But most of our tribal people don't. So the ability to find close matches can be quite a challenge, because a lot of our families are never going to test. They don't believe in it. There's a couple of different spiritual reasons that they may not do it. And so that could be an issue in the sense of trying to find the matches. On the other hand, if it does come up as DNA, and with the refinements that are happening in the science and some of that, at least some of the elements of DNA identification can help to narrow it. Like, this is more North American, it's now South American, or, that kind of thing. However, will we ever get down to tribal? No, I truly, everybody that I've been talking to, I really don't think so. Well, because we intermarried, and because, intermarried across tribal boundaries. I mean, that's for any number of reasons. That's, kind of a challenge. And then again, if you don't have a basic Native group that has been able to stay in a prescribed sort of area, right? And then there's genocide. So there's whole groups of people that have been wiped out. So, if you're going back to fourth, fifth, generation ago ancestor, you may have very few living descendants from that person because of genocide. So the matching kind of thing. But if you have it come up it does, there are ways to kind of dig into that. Of course, I'm not a DNA expert, but I can guide people on some basic stuff with the chromosome mapping and, different tools. But the challenge that often happens is the story exists. The person tests their DNA and they don't find it in their DNA. Well, that doesn't mean they aren't. It just means that they didn't inherit that piece, right? And I think, from the standpoint of, I'm sure all of you have gone through at least the basic DNA class, and, there's entirely the possibility that you wouldn't show anything if it was 4 or 5 generations ago, but your brother might, right? So that gives the example of test everybody in the family that'll consent to testing, because somebody might show up with that piece that will verify your story for you.
And I've always had the impression that cultures that have a strong oral history tradition, that they have a higher accuracy rate as some of the other, is that true, or is that just in my head?
I'm sorry, say that again.
So that I've always believed, I don't know why, that there are some cultures that have a very strong oral history tradition, and that was a way of preserving history, versus my family that just seemed to embellish and make up stories on the fly. And, oh yeah, we had that relative from Georgia, or maybe it was Louisiana. It was one of them southern states. We don't tell the stories in a historical manner. So I was just wondering if in Native American storytelling, if you find that there is a greater accuracy in those stories and find them even perhaps more useful than in other cultures. Just family traditions can be a clue, but not.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying. I guess probably, well, there's kind of two things I would say. Number one, yeah, we've got people that embellish a lot too, right? On the other hand, because it is so significantly part of our tribal culture, there is a whole mechanism of memorization involved.
Yeah.
So the memorization part, and so the winter is the time that we gather and tell stories, right? As it gets cold, that's when the storytelling happens. The rest of the year, when you can be outdoors, that's not storytelling time so much. Although, anymore when I gather with the family out in South Dakota, well, there's always ever present a bonfire and we're sitting under the stars, right? So yes, some stories happen then, but it's very classically part of our winter. And you're raised as a kid with certain elements, right? So for instance, when we bury our dead, the youngest children are made to stand on the grave and look around. So on some people would say, oh my God, that'd be traumatic. Like, why would you do that to a child? Well, but it's part of our culture to acknowledge that death is part of life and life is part of death. And so having the child stand on the grave and look around helps them to remember where this person is buried. So many of us on our allotments have family burial sites. So, I've documented ours so that it's on Find a Grave, so that, the descendants and all the collateral families have that as well as a paper trail, right? Because otherwise you can't come on our land without us knowing you're coming, right?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so that's part of the oral tradition, is this repetitiveness of the stories. And then certain stories are so sacred that only certain people can tell them. So then you really work hard to get to be with those people so that you can hear those really important stories. So so our family is a medicine family. That means that we do a lot of ceremony. So there's elements of the oral history that I've heard that is regularly told, kind of the funny stories about when my grandmother, and what silly things she'd do. But then there's parts of the story that are about the ceremonial relationships And that you have to go to certain uncles and, elders to get that information. But it's the strength of the memory functions that we're all taught that you're supposed to know this stuff.
Wow.
Interesting, very interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Before we move on, because Melissa's got a question, I wanted to say something about Shelley's comment too, but back to the DNA, just really quick, I wanted to ask you one quick question. And I know you said you're not a DNA expert, and I don't know that anybody on this panel is a DNA expert. And that's why I wanted to ask you though, at the beginning, when I first tested several years ago, there was a small percent of Native American in my mom and then down to me, and now it's just gone. And so,
as they update the
right.
Testing data. Yeah. Well, and some of that is just, again, it's reflecting intermarriage. So as they refine some elements of it, and again, not being, particularly adept at that, but, I am a scientist from schooling and I get what they're trying to do. It's just that the complication of it is the intermarriage and the fact that the tribal groups were forced away, so that it's not like you have a distinct element that's been there for 4 generations.
Right.
2 generations maybe were in South Carolina, but then 1 generation was in Tennessee and the other one now is in Michigan. So, and they intermarried with different people as they went through those areas. It wasn't like, even though we have similar mechanisms of not marrying first cousins and all of that. So some tribal groups have a clan-based system. Our tribal group is called a Tiwahe and a Tioshbe. So that Tiwahe is family. So that's sort of the immediate blood kin that are descended from the same grandparents. And then the Tioshbe is the larger community group that are all descended from an ancestor, typically about 4 generations ago. So, and so if you were to get a Tiwahe group to test, that would give you some pretty significant stuff. But again, to my point, Native people don't have money. If you're wanting to test me for free, I might consider it, but I also have spiritual reasons to not give up a part of me, right?
Gotcha.
So,
So,
as people like me test, or as other people, so those of us who are biracial, as we maybe test, there might be an element of some refinement, let's say, but I don't know that it's going to, I just don't know that it's going to get down to the level of tribal. I think it could get down to the level of geography. So that you could say, oh, yes, these people came from the North and South Carolina area.
Right.
That kind of thing. But I don't know if it's going to come down to tribal. I really don't. And I will mention that because of racism, I don't think it's a priority.
Oh, of course.
I really don't. Yeah. I really don't.
And I agree with you.
And, on some level, that's a part of racism I'm okay with, because I don't know that I want you to know, right? I mean, I've tested and I'm, fine with that. But there's whole people in my family that don't want it. They just don't want any part of it.
Just don't want to know. Okay. Yeah. So that having that little bit of now being gone doesn't really mean that it was there. And I mean, something was.
It certainly could be there. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't already done, what is the tool, GenMatch. If you haven't already used that,
I have, and it's still
there's
still
those
there on
refinements
there too.
that you do.
Yeah. Yep.
So sometimes it'll say, hunter gatherer, or something like that. So I encourage you to look at that, and then just keep watching, right? Because every time they do a refinement, you don't know how. I mean, wasn't it one of the refinements when all of us suddenly were Scottish, right?
Yeah.
Everybody.
They're still carrying that one right now.
But the science of it is valid. It's just how it gets identified and marked.
I gotcha.
right?
Gotcha.
And
Well, thank
yeah.
you.
Or they
Yeah.
just dropped a whole bunch of tests that too, is what I think they do. Because all of a sudden, maybe they just sold a whole bunch of tests in Scotland. Now everything got all, because it happened to me.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there and I have the Native Americans show up, and I'm not sure if it's, we say it's Ottawa Indian because we're all from Michigan and everywhere in Virginia and stuff like that. So in my connection, because I made the comment earlier in the chat, and we run into this a lot, and at least I do, that there's so many people that got that Indian princess story, and even
God bless
within the
us.
family. And again, we connect to the bands up there and Bear Lake, Michigan, up there where the, stuff is up there, and Standing Rock and all of that, and at Fort Yates. But it's like, well, wait a minute, you can't take the picture. This is my version. You can't take the picture of what you saw on TV and claim that's your Native American ancestry. Because I'm looking at you, you're fine with me because I've seen other people that have half or even more that look just like you, and nobody would assume it's Native American. You would just be white. And so again, those bands up there, and I'm going to say this part of Michigan,
Here, yeah, okay,
this part of Michigan, and the Ottawa bands up there and stuff, and again, you can't look at somebody and identify them.
No, you can't.
Exactly. And people try to do that, because the line of my family that the story comes down, they'll look at their pictures and say, oh yeah, I believe it because look at their cheekbones or look at their hair. I mean, it's like
just a medical condition. And I had to look it up because somebody challenged me, because that was something you always grew up hearing, the long, dark, straight hair. And the white people in my family got dark hair, and it's long and it's straight. So I never, as a child, I couldn't, disconnect that. But it's just interesting that people are going to take it to their grave that they got that Indian princess story because it came through. And then when it doesn't show up on DNA, it's DNA's fault. The
DNA is wrong.
The whole Indian.
Oh, go ahead.
The whole Indian princess piece, right? So just even that identification, right? Like, gets me tense, because that actually is derived from colonialists who came from monarchy countries and thought that, well, if this is the daughter of a chief, we'll equate him to the king. So the daughter must be a princess. And it's so flippin' racist, right? So anytime I hear it, I mean, I try to be gentle, because people, are well-intentioned.
I was very careful.
Yeah, you have to be careful.
Because I know this is going to be on YouTube.
Well, but
I could have said it.
And I am saying flipping. I'm not saying.
I know. And that's a derogatory term too.
Thank you.
Actually, but nonetheless, I mean, there's all of these sort of racist languaging that gets used around our people, and so many people who decide they want to be Native, they didn't go through the troubles we have. Like, they don't know that it's just sort of hip now. Well, really? Where were you when our people were getting massacred and thrown into boarding schools and our women sterilized? Like, where were your people weren't there? Like, sorry. So I kind of get riled, but
well, that's okay. And I think for us that are in the genealogy field, we see that, and we just want to know who our people were. So I want to know where that Native American DNA, if it's really there, came from. I've got African American DNA. I want to know where that came from, so I want to know. And so that's why we're searching, and that's the reason to search, not to be hip or popular or anything. Well,
and
like
especially to get into the story of our people, right? It's not about the birth, marriage, and death dates. It's about who they were and how did they live, and how did they, raise their children, and what did they do
Right.
to make ends meet in the tough times?
Exactly.
And yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. I agree. It's just, it's about finding those really beautiful and really impactful stories that, you know, tell us about resilience and strength and humor, right? Our people had lots of humor to get them through the tough times. So yeah, it is about those stories, and I honor and you know, respect that. So that's, you know, when somebody says the sort of Indian princess thing, but I have had enough of those people that want to be clients say the worst things that I've literally hung up the phone because it's just so awful. Like a young man wanting to go to law school, claiming to be Indian and having none, but saying, well, they won't check. A future law student. I'm like, oh, that's a lovely way for a lawyer to start out his career. Slam. You know, I mean, really? Yeah. So, but
that's terrible.
Yeah. Take advantage of the system, but yet you're going to be the system.
Yeah. You're going to be the system. That's scary. Melissa, you had a question, then I know Bernice has a question.
Let Bernice go, because I've already asked a question. She has it.
Okay.
It's not so much a question as it is a comment that you will find the African European connection, and because of the appearance, they attribute it to being Native American.
Yes.
Or misattribute Native American.
Yes.
However, you know, I think that we have a problem here, you know, just with understanding who we are. And when you see DNA, you wonder, well, what are the reference populations? You know, because if I look at my DNA and all of the companies, no matter what, I have Native American ancestry. One of the companies, 5.8%, another company, 2.8%. And they put me all over the place, you know, in Mayan, and they put me in Choctaw. And I mean, I grew up here in Choctaw because I'm from Louisiana, Southeast Louisiana to be specific, you know, and so that is where the Choctaw were. But also I have ancestry out of South Carolina, and the Cherokee. So I think we need to really examine, what are people really saying? And it's almost like it's a fantasy that has not been proven. And there's so much, as you've mentioned, the racism, what has happened to the indigenous population, just as what has happened to Africans that were brought here, forcibly migrated to the United States, and all kinds of things happen. But I want to get back to you mentioning some of the records. You talk.
Well, can I mention something though, Bernice, that kind of a lot of people don't recognize that back in the day, Native people had Black enslaved people.
Oh yeah.
And intermarried.
Yes.
So when you're saying that you know that you're coming up with Native ancestry, that doesn't surprise me at all. Because certainly in the Southeast, especially, the Seminole were known to have enslaved people, that a lot of the tribal people intermarried with people that had been enslaved or escaped, you know, and then married and, you know, lived in the hills, and people that helped them to manage, right? So yes, so it's mixed. And then how much of that spread across the country? And so then people that find it in their ancestry don't realize that these two populations often cohabited, right? So keep looking for those family references that might say mulatto, right? The M word, or I or IN in their census records or something like that. Look deeper, because that might be a Black person that married with an Indian, and now they're just calling them mixed and whatever the terminology was in the time. But you were going to ask a question about the records. Go ahead.
Yes, and you mentioned the intermarriage, and also the fact that some Native tribes enslaved Africans.
Correct. Very
African
much so.
Americans. I mean,
Very
you talk
much
about the 5 civilized tribes, and you talk about, well, what's happening to the records and the forced migration, and some not even being recognized in Oklahoma. You have all of these issues that are happening today.
Right.
But yes, I want to talk about the records. I've gone to the National Archives before they moved the library, and you could go in and look at all the treaties and read what happened. And I would find myself so angry because as you read, you could see what was happening to the land. I mean, just turning over, it's basically stealing the land right there, and it's very well documented. But how much of the information we should know or could know, if we could find that, would you recommend we do? What steps would you recommend if you wanted to find records of the Indigenous population in a specific, let's say, region? You talked about we need to do research on various territories, but exactly where do you go?
Well, definitely, like I was earlier talking about, archives and university collections and special collections, so certainly within Native circles, so those of us that do that kind of research, we know that, oh, okay, if I'm over in California, I'm going to go to the Sutro collection. Oh, if I'm in the Detroit area, I'm going to go to Mount Pleasant. Oh, if I'm over, so there's that kind of thing. I will tell you that one of the most fascinating resources that I've found is the Library of Congress. Like literally just typing in a Native surname, a Native name, as phonetically varied as I can get, I have found my ancestors in the Library of Congress records because the Indian agents had to give reports to Congress. So, it's mostly lists of men. And it's mostly lists of like, these are the people that are going to live in this territory. So, they kind of set up those territories, which we now call reservations or reserves in Canada. But in the Library of Congress records, there's a wealth of resources in, not only that, but I found our house as an original brand new house on our allotment. I found a picture of it in the records of the Indian official reporting to Congress. So, there's a lot of, you can get to a lot of depth. So the finding aids that the archives have, and then especially cultivating a relationship with an archivist who knows about, because again, to Melissa's point, they all know each other. They're all sharing information back and forth. They have conferences. They know what's going on in different parts of the country. Cultivating a relationship with them and saying, what do you know about what happened with the Delaware people? Like, how do I get more information? What archives should I be tapping? What book might be a good resource because it has great citations in it to other records that I can go dig into? So yes, like most genealogy, it's a lot of reading. It's a lot of historical reading. Because you have to know where were our people in a point in time because we were from somewhere else before. Right. So, like one of the examples, so I'm learning a lot about tribal people here in Michigan because it's where I live. My people are not from here, but I want to know about the records. Well, I was blessed to be able to sit with an elder, and he told me about their forced migration that got them down as far as Mexico, believe it or not. And they were given the option by the territorial, so this was when Michigan was a territory, they were given the option by the territorial authorities, well, go and find a place that you feel comfortable. You can't stay here, but you can go and find a place and then just stay there. Well, so some of the men went out and traveled as far south as Mexico, and they had contact with other tribal people along the way who would say, no, you can't stay here, this is ours, and whatever. Well, they went as far as Mexico and then turned around and came back to Michigan, and at that point there had been so it took a couple of years, obviously, And there had been a shift in policy so that they were allowed to then stay in Michigan. It wasn't entirely in the exact same place, but somewhat close to it, very much reduced land, but at least back. And so then they brought their families in and they came back together. And so this was an elder I met in Mount Pleasant, which is near one of the really largest tribal groups here in Michigan. And I didn't know that they walked that far to Mexico. No, this wasn't the same kind of forced march as the Trail of Tears was, or the long walk that the Dene went through, or any of that. But they were forced out of a territory and told, go find someplace.
Go find someplace else.
Yeah. It's remarkable. Like even in the case of the Dene, so you might know them as the Navajo. Well, they went on what's called the longest walk, and they were sent away. But then they are the only tribal group in the whole contiguous United States that were allowed to actually come back to their original territory. And they have the largest land holdings of any tribal group because they were allowed to come back. But, oh, by the way, it wasn't good farming land. Now it has minerals under it. And so it's very valuable now because of the minerals and the tourism, right? Because it's a beautiful part of the country, the Four Corners area, But at the time they were allowed to come back, it wasn't particularly good farming.
Right.
So,
Mary, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about sites like Archive Grid. I mean, are Native resources well represented on that?
Yes and no. There are resources on a lot of the online sites. Are they complete? No. Again, to the point that a lot of stuff has not been prioritized for our people and for our research. It's getting better, but really the depth of the stuff is in the archives and the special collections and things like that because of people who took an interest in the records and then collected them. So they kept, like here in Detroit, the Trapper Trader records from the early time when the fort was here, different regions of the country that kept the records because tribal people were there. And, somebody advocated because of, they were studying anthropology at a certain university. I found like a whole bunch of really good Lakota records in Nebraska, which is just a tiny portion of what used to be our territory. But the University of Nebraska, in its special collections, has a bunch of Native resources. So, it's that you have to look at geography with different eyes. Take out the state lines, take out the county lines, because we moved and shifted to adapt. And it didn't matter what the lines were because we didn't have to mind them, right? We just, if we're going to go fishing, we're heading over to the next county. We didn't care that it was a county line, right?
Exactly.
So really the bulk of the records that are really valuable are in archives. Now, yes, you can get fundamental records up to about, I would say the 1880s. You can get some. So there's a number of census records. On the East Coast, you can go back further. So David Lambert, I'll tell you, is a marvelous resource for the New England tribal groups. He's actually been adopted by one of them.
That's
and
right.
He's a marvelous resource for what happened and what kind of records there are there. But again, notably, it's the men that are documented, not as much the women.
Go ahead, Mary.
Will those records, like the Lakota ones that you mentioned. I mean, you got to, in order to go to the archive, you got to figure out that the archive has records. So is Archive Grid a useful site for finding that? I mean, if they have them, are they going to be mentioned on Archive Grid? Not
uniformly. I'll tell you, not uniformly. I have found records outside of that and not had an indication, thankfully, because of some people that have helped me do some of this research, archivists who have given me a clue, you need to talk to, Stephen Jones over at such and such. And then they'll make like an email introduction, and then you start asking specific questions. I just can't say enough about building relationships with archivists, because they'll hold it in their mind and they'll niggle around in their mind, and then they'll come back to you, like 2 or 3 days later. I'm like, I forgot about this, but I went and looked, and I think you might want to look here, that kind of thing. So I can't say enough about that, developing a relationship. It's about that vast knowledge that archivists build, that they've got here, right? They might have a card catalog, they might have, a reading aid, they might have, or a finding aid, they might have a variety of things that they can go and look at. But it first niggles around in here when you tell them, I'm looking specifically for this group of people. And if you give them a couple alternative words, because a lot of our Lakota people, in addition to our community and our family names, we have tribal sort of, what would you say? Like sort of bands, if you will. So within the Lakota world, there are 7 what we call council fires. And each of the council fires breaks down into smaller groups, and they all have Lakota words. You can't, I suppose you could try and translate them to English, but they wouldn't make sense. So, but if you know those words and you can give that to the archivist, that might trigger, oh, I remember seeing that in this and this. And I can't tell you how many times being in an archive, I'll have that conversation, or then I go home and I'll email my thank you back, or I'll send them a little gift or something. And then it's like, well, what else are you looking for? Like, what do you think there might be out there? And then I'll tell them, and then it might be a while because they're busy too, and they've got patrons and other people. But then it's niggling around in their brain, and they come back with it.
Melissa says yes.
Yeah, well, Melissa knows.
And to add to that, I mean, when we get new records collections donated, or we get into a collection of records that haven't been processed yet, we run across those surnames or those keywords or something, and we go, wait a minute, there was someone that was here a month ago that was, and then we go look, and we try to make that connection because we want to help them. But I did have 2 questions, and one I think is kind of silly, but the one is, and it kind of came to me back when Laura asked her question about DNA, so we're kind of going back to DNA. But it came to me, and I wasn't going to ask this question until she asked hers, but it came to me. I wonder how many people who have gotten their DNA tested and they see that piece of Native American, and for the lack of, this is going to sound so crude, but and they show up on your doorstep and say, okay, I'm here, I'm Native American, I want to join the tribe. What from the tribal aspect, what do they think of, I'll say us, but I don't have any, but us that are finding this in our DNA and are now ready to be part of the tribe?
Well, so there's a couple of things about that. So number one, many of the tribal groups are very welcoming. So we are a very welcoming, warm people. It's like, if you're related to us, yes, come in.
That was kind of the mistake they made back in them colonial times.
And don't you know, right?
I'm just saying that they were welcoming.
Shelley
shouldn't have been so welcoming, But it is a classic aspect of tribal culture to just be welcoming and offer people coffee and whatever. So tribal, so there's 574 federally recognized tribes in the country. There's a couple hundred more that are state recognized, and then there's others that are in the process. So if somebody's like, oh, I think I'm Choctaw, and I want to find out more about Choctaw. And so the thing that I often tell them is, don't just show up at the tribal enrollment office, right? Reach out first, because they're massively busy people. They aren't paid particularly well. If they have one person who is a tribal enrollment officer and doesn't wear 4 other hats, that's unusual, right? So send an email first. say, this is what I think I know, and I want to know more. How would you guide me? But before you send the email, explore their website, get a history book, read about what happened to the people so that you have some basic fundamental sensitivity to like not offending, right?
Right.
So, so learn some basic. There we go. Then the other aspect that the enrollment officers have to do is go, like in assisting people who want to become enrolled. And there's political and economic reasons for denying enrollment. So and without going into that's a fairly long conversation of all the detail of that. But for someone who is just discovering it in their DNA and goes in and says, well, I want to join the tribe, immensely insensitive, number one. Number two, they're not going to get anywhere. The people will be polite, but just won't answer their questions. And again, to the point of they're understaffed, they're under-resourced, and, in this point, they're also like, I've had enough of racism, and you're probably not Indian, you're just playing. So, I usually encourage first learn a bunch of history, find out where your people are from. If they're from Choctaw territory, then study up on the Choctaw, whether it's the Choctaw in Oklahoma or the Choctaw back east, right? Find out what they went through and learn some of that, and then try and place your family in time in that same geography. If it doesn't match, then think about, well, who was in that territory? So there's wonderful online tools now, and there's actually an app. And I'm going to be at a loss here for a minute, but I can look for it. The app actually shows the United States, and it'll drill down to the state and local level and tell you who the tribal people were in that particular part of the country, so that you can actually think, oh, okay, well, maybe my people weren't Choctaw. Maybe we were, Cherokee is in that same region, and, others. But anyway.
That's a good answer, yeah.
Narrowing, right? And especially with whatever the paper trail you can get to, and then send an email to the enrollment office. I found my family in Southeast South Carolina. I think our people were Choctaw. And here's what I know. Dates, times, places, these are the names. And then you also send money.
Yeah.
So they have to document the money, right? And don't send cash, you send a check. But they have to document the money. But the fact that you honored the fact that they have to do some work for you, you're at least offering to pay them for their time. And again, because they're under-resourced and understaffed, that will at least get your part of the query to the top of the list, because they're getting hundreds of them with no money enclosed and hardly any detail. So you've elevated your request at least to that enrollment officer. Now, don't expect an immediate response.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, that will help to sort of make you more, let's say, approachable, right? You've come to them respectfully with enough information. You've done your research clearly, and you're offering some cash to thank them for their efforts. Most tribal groups have their own roles. So a lot of people know about the Dawes Rules, the really big one that documents the 5 tribes. And I won't say the word C with that, 5C tribe. I won't say that. But the Dawes Rules is one of the largest. But everybody says, well, have you looked in the Dawes Rules? Well, if my people were Odawa from here in Michigan, no, they're not going to be in the Dawes Rules. So then you give up and you're all sad. You have to know which roles go with which people.
It's knowing the records. Like
exactly.
it's
It's
just
knowing the
records.
records, like anything in genealogy. And the National Archives has a whole page about the Indian rolls. But then the tribal groups themselves create rolls because they're trying to manage their enrollment process. And the enrollment process, I could do a whole talk about for hours, but we won't.
Thank you for that. That was a great answer to my question. And I'm glad that it's being recorded so that whoever watches this will know what they need to do.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'm glad Laura kept it going while who knows what kicked me off. And I was so sad on the other end until I heard, oh, Laura still got it going. So
I think Shelley had a comment she wanted to make.
Yeah, I wanted a quick comment. In the last, I'm going to say the past pre-COVID, but I noticed that I'm in Virginia, by the way, even though I'm a Michigander, I am in Virginia. And but I've noticed the universities, University of Virginia, William and Mary, these older, very old universities, anything they're putting out or an event, first thing they do is acknowledge whose land they're on. And I don't know if you guys have caught that, but that is like a speech right off, acknowledging that, like University of Virginia talks about the Monacan Indians and stuff, because all through this area where I'm at in Central Virginia was Monacan land, and they have a museum down in Amherst, or by Lynchburg, Amherst County. And, people go there saying, oh, I'm Indian, this, that, and other. Well, they got surnames. They have names. So if you're not connecting to one of those names, you're probably not going to get through that door as much, because you got to connect. They know they have been here, I'm going to say, since dirt turned over. But again, these older institutions are, and I'm saying William and Mary is almost as old as Harvard, I think, is the oldest, or one of them. But TJ started UVA construction was like 1817 or something like that. But they are now acknowledging.
Yeah. Shelley, I'll add to that. That of course I get regular correspondence, not personally, but to other archivists from David Ferriero, who's the U.S. archivist.
White shoes.
I've noticed that they have started in their communications, and anytime he comes on with the video, it's the same thing.
It is the same thing. And I just want to say I'm appreciative of that. Yes. Because even though I've got my African side, I've got my white side, and I got a little native side, it's still acknowledging who was really here. Might not all come out, but most of it is. At least they're acknowledging the grounds. And I respect that and appreciate that. So, and I probably need to do the same thing as an employee of that university when I talk about the slave laborers. And the other comment was that in the Freedmen Bureau records, I have list, and I got the IND noted as well, right? Cherokee, or just Indian and things like that. So yeah, people got to also think about the time period, and like you said, the location can lead you, but it can't just be one location. And another chance, I'm going to email you an oral history story that came through our family up there in Manistee County.
All right.
I was going to do the same thing, so we need to get your email address.
Oh, I'll put it in the chat box. Do you want me to do that?
What we'll do too is any links that you can share with us, anything like that you could send to me, I will put in the show notes when this goes out. And so people can, where would you suggest they may start? Those kind of things. The link to your to your blog, to your webpage, and all that, so that people can watch this. They're all going to say, okay, now where do I go from here? And so we'll get that kind of information from you that will be in the show notes and on the YouTube page where this goes up. So this has been quite a wonderful discussion. It has been
fascinating, really.
Exactly. And much longer than I'm sorry if we kept you longer than.
Oh, not to worry. I'll talk about it all night if y'all want to be here till midnight.
No problem. We would talk about it all night as well. We would.
Well, there's just so much. And, you know, like I was trying to prepare, I've got like my desk, like all sorts of little bits here, right? Because I wanted to, like, there's so much. And, you know, like getting started is one thing, but once you know a tribal identification, then there's another whole level. And, you know, and it just keeps getting deeper and deeper. But to the point of the native land, so I put it in the chat. This is an app for your phone. So it's an app for your phone, and you have to turn on the location aspect of your phone. But then it'll bring up the whole, all of, actually, I'm wondering if it even brings up Central and South America. I know it brings up North America. But it brings up, it goes down into Central and South America.
I'm not traveling anytime soon.
What's that?
I said, I'm not traveling anytime soon.
Well, you don't have to travel. No, it brings up the map and it tells you the general territory of the tribal people.
That's fabulous.
So that you can see who overlapped with who, which is probably what the intermarriage pattern was, which is also giving you, like, you know, like I said, our Lakota people were here in Michigan, but then got forced west. And oh, by the way, not forced west by the colonists, forced west by other tribes.
Correct.
So, you know, like there's that, but then there's also the element too, that these maps have our words for ourselves. I've been using Lakota. You all know Sioux, right? So Sioux isn't our word for ourselves. It actually means a place of land that looks like a snake. Well, Lakota means friend or ally. We refer to ourselves that way. Most tribal people refer to themselves as the original ones, the old ones, or the people, right? Well, if you know those alternate words, then you also get access to alternate records because you can search, you know, differently. If I search using Lakota, I get one set of records and information. If I search using Sioux, I get another set of records and information. So if you know both, and this particular app shows you the original tribal language names for ourselves. So that's really helpful. And there are maps that, you know, give that as well. So,
Love it.
It goes deeper and deeper and deeper.
Thank you. And like I said, we will get links and so that people can get a hold of you if they want to, or, you know, these resources and things. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you all. Great questions. And, you know, now I have a new circle of friends. I already knew Laura, of course. And I know Dan, he's crazy.
And you know me.
And I know you. And I know Mary from APG. And so Bernice spoke at our conference here in Michigan. So I'm getting to know more of you, and I'm glad to meet Shelley and Melissa, and I hope you all will stay in touch.
Yes.
We will definitely. Thank you so much. And Laura, I will let you hit end record so everything will stay on your end. So we will see you next time on Gen Friends. Thanks, everybody.